This conference will now be recorded.
their position. It literally happened without my knowledge. I showed up at a meeting, some people nominated me, and I got voted into this chair. I think in turn lost my predecessor as a position of counsel, which was a big loss because Rob Brown had a huge wealth of knowledge about how this whole thing operates. And I feel like he felt like he was sort of out there on an island, and I'm speaking for him now, but his participation waned almost immediately. And I really don't think that's what we want. I've been involved in some different statewide committees. And what I think is most appropriate is at Ed's suggestion, that these two positions time out opposite of each other, that there's no ultimate limitation on how many terms you would serve, but they would be on a 5-year cycle consistent with the RA cycle. And that as you become past chair, at least for some period of time, you're available for counsel or direction, or historic perspective on how this ad hoc group that has been so successful that they try to model it in other places continues on. So that's what this memo is about. I don't know, Maya, if you wanted to add anything else to that. And just so everybody knows, I will just say this. I consider what I've been involved here with for the last 25 years truly joyful work. This is a part of our profession that we don't get to really necessarily participate in as much as we want. It's a part of our perception that's sort of a add-on, but the outcome associated with this kind of work is you know, just far-reaching, quite honestly. I can't imagine if the whole thing had fell apart back in the 03 to 07 period when we were working to keep everybody solvent, but at the same time protect the bay. I think that there's just this ad hoc consortium is just a model for many areas that have had suffered from what we suffered from and still suffer from in some more limited areas of the bay. And it's just, if I was going to continue working for another 10 years, I wouldn't be up here talking to you about this. I wouldn't probably have come to mind for me that this is something that really needs to happen, so that we get some new blood in here and some new ideas in here before I'm out hiking the Appalachian Trail. So with that said, Maya, you want to add a little bit more detail to the memo? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think also as the estuary program, you know, broadly, we realize that our staff is small and we do this work on behalf of you all as our community, and we couldn't do this work on our own. We rely on you all as our partners to accomplish this work. And so through our own strategic planning, we've recognized that we need to be conscientious and intentional about how we make sure that you all are really actively participating in the management and the decisions guiding the management of Tampa Bay. And so, you know, that aligns with some of our goals programmatically as well. And I think if y'all look around the room, you know, there's a whole lot of new faces in the virtual room as well as in, you know, the in-person space right here. And there's a huge learning curve that comes along with understanding all of the nuance, the technical nuance, the regulatory nuance, the people side of all of this. And so we want to make sure that we're providing you all with the expertise necessary to be informed, active participants in that. And so really appreciate Jeff's candor and recognizing that he's not going to be here working professionally for that much longer, and that it would be beneficial for us to outline a really clear process for how we can bring up the next generation of leaders through the consortium. So when we talked with Tino and Jeff and internally as a team, we kind of had a few key things that we wanted to lay out in this memo, but this is your consortium. And so if you all have additional or a different perspective on information you would like to be included in this decision memo, we're asking for that feedback now. Like Jeff mentioned, essentially what we want to do is provide sufficient notice so that people can think about whether or not they're ready to volunteer to step up into a leadership role. So when we're expecting some kind of transition or turnover in leadership, we want to give plenty of advance notice so people can consider that in the context of the rest of their own teams, their own leadership chains back at your home institution. And then we can communicate who is interested in serving in a leadership capacity, and then you can all think about, who you think has the skill set, the requisite skill set to bring us along over the course of a 5-year period, and then we can have those open nominations with plenty of time and thought behind it. So we wanted to lay out that kind of commitment to a nomination process. We also didn't want us to be in a position where we lose 2 strong leaders at one time. So we think that we ought to be staggering the turnover for nominations. So we should have 1 experienced co-chair at all times, and they should be helping train up their co-chair, their equal co-chair, their equal partner. So that's what we lay out in the nomination section. In the term section, we are proposing a 5-year term that aligns with the reasonable assurance cycle. So you would have the local government co-chair that rotates off sort of mid-cycle, and that facilitates Jeff's desires for when he's planning to retire and how he could provide support to his successor. And then the industry co-chair would be someone who's rotating off and on at the beginning of a new RA cycle. We know that a 5-year term is longer than some, what some professional organizations have, but we do think that that kind of tenure is necessary to provide the stability for an RA cycle. And we don't think that you ought to limit that. I mean, 1 5-year term would be fine, but if you wanted to serve for successive terms, if you still have the confidence of everyone in the consortium, we don't think there needs to be a limit on that. It would be at the discretion of all the players involved. So we've proposed that in the terms section of this memo. And then finally, many organizations do have a formal past chair role where someone who has sort of been in the trenches, been through all this, seen it from both sides, had the public face and been in the back rooms, sort of hearing people's candid conversations. So we don't think that this is a requirement, but we think that if you have a person who has served as a chair before, is still in good standing with the consortium, and is willing and able to provide additional level of counsel to the chairs, to the current co-chairs, that's something that we should formally encourage so that they can provide that sort of advisory kind of capacity, serve on that advisory capacity to folks, whether it's about how to build consensus, how we've done things in the past, what the historical context is, or some of the really challenging science that's behind all of those things. So those were the highlights that we thought were important to commemorate in a decision memo. If y'all, like I said, if you have suggestions or recommended changes, we can capture those now, and then it's sort of at your discretion of whether or not you're ready to act and vote on a decision memo today, or if you want to consider it, at the next meeting, which is scheduled for August, and then sort of kick things off from there. But we wanted to put this before you in some sort of fully fleshed out version, so you had something to react to, and you can decide if you were ready to act today, or if you needed more time to consider.
Vivian Leaves asked online, what happens if the term of the chair is interrupted? I think at that point we would hold an ad hoc nomination and election.
Yeah.
So any comments or concerns or questions or?
I had one question. So it sounds like, so the idea is to stagger the 2 co-chairs, but if you base it on that 5-year planning cycle, then one of those co-chairs is going to be offset. Like let's say 27 to 32 is a 5-year block. And let's say we replace Jeff with that local government chair, but then the industry chair will be offset. So they won't encapsulate a
So the industry,
process.
The way that it's set up right now, the industry chair would get a whole RA cycle, and the government chair would span 2 cycles.
2, okay. So the government chair would be in process? I mean, you can't obviously.
Yeah, we talked about this internally,
Yeah.
and so I think this is a fair point for
Okay.
discussion. But that's currently what we're proposing, is that the government rep would span 2 cycles. They would be the mid. And that's largely because Jeff's going to retire.
Historically, we have people, you guys have given my staff heart palpitations back there.
One day in the future.
Historically, we have had people run about 2 cycles. I don't think Tony might be able to speak, Ed might be able to speak to that, but it seems that way. I think Rob was around for about 10 years. Jeff Stewart was around for at least 10 years, I'm aware of. So it probably wouldn't end up being a huge issue, but we did talk specifically about that. I think that they may be in the wrong place because I think that the heavier, well, maybe not. I think the heavy lift's going to be stormwater over the next 10 years. Stormwater loads over the next 10 years. I think that's what we're sort of left with on the table, to be honest. Senate Bill 64 is going to largely remove all the point source discharges, at least the domestic ones, which dominate the watershed, which there's not a whole lot there to take a bite out of anyway. So it's just anything, Chris, you got an idea. I'm a little more open, you know that. So.
Yeah, no, I don't think there's a way around it if you're going to stagger unless you adjust the term to maybe make it even longer or shorter. But I don't have a problem with it. I just wanted to make sure I was clear that, one of those co-chairs is going to cover 2 cycles, but not completely. So one chair will have 1 complete cycle. The other will have, which is fine. I mean, for continuity, that's good because the lessons learned from the previous cycle can be then carried over into the current cycle.
And that's one way that we discussed it. Oftentimes when we put out a request for proposals with sort of a work agenda for that RA period, some of those include, technical memos, decision memos, or, other work that we're asking for on behalf of, questions that you all are encountering and raising as a consortium. And sometimes ultimately that work is completed and it gets wrapped into the reasonable assurance update. And sometimes that work is sort of just left sort of hanging. And so we were thinking that perhaps there's somebody that can then continue to champion, like seeing things come full circle to come to more full closure. But we did, Ed, I don't know if you want to offer, we did also talk about, having greater overlap in the terms. So maybe you would have 1 cycle off during the last year of a reasonable assurance plan and 1 cycle on during the first year. So you wouldn't have a brand new co-chair, but you would have somebody that had maybe like a year's worth of experience. So that's another alternative that would get it closer to people being in a leadership role for a full cycle. Like I said, all fair questions.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. We're assuming that, or I was under the assumption that 1 chair would start on year 1 of that plan cycle, but it doesn't have to. You're right. We can offset both of them.
Well, there's sort of like a natural overlap in the timing anyways, because we're finishing up the reasonable assurance plan for 1 5-year period during year 1 of the subsequent. So that's another way.
And I think as Maya mentioned, we talked internally, I think there is value in having sort of overlap between RA cycles because of sort of continuity of issues that don't get addressed fully in one particular RA cycle that need to get addressed in the next. And having a co-chair kind of representing that through both cycles is important, I think.
Ed, on the succession piece, did y'all talk about or consider, I don't know if you would like designate a number of different individuals for each co-chair, as kind of like co-chairs in training or something like that, where, we had some focused effort around getting those folks comfortable with the history and decisions that have been made. I wrote a note down for Jeff a minute ago, since we do see a lot of new faces, would we maybe offer like a short course, you know, for people that are new to the consortium to try and get everybody at the same level of understanding in terms of the history of the work. So any thoughts to that?
Yeah, I think certainly we could offer that support as that street program. I think some of the past chair sort of responsibilities, I think we're looking at as sort of like a mentorship as well, but definitely that street program can provide sort of the initial orientation for any new co-chairs coming into the fold. And we tried to do that. I hope we did that with you all too during the process of you guys becoming co-chair as well. That isn't going away from that street program standpoint.
I think you guys do a good job too, of posting past documents, being able to, like, if somebody's new to the consortium, there's a lot of documentation that is available for folks to read, get caught up.
Certainly, and that's what we're trying to do strategically with the program, to sort of that shared knowledge. You know, I've learned from Tony's group. I'm passing that knowledge on now to Marcus and Maya. So that continuity is important, I think, in the work that the consortium does, and making those translations externally to partners is something we are committing to. And if we want to formalize it in this document, I have no problem doing that as the district program.
Can I add? So I know I'm new to the group, but my internal perspective on the past chair, if you're a government employee and you leave the chair position and also retire from the government, there are certain things that you cannot do within a year, regardless of if it's at a volunteer level or not, in order to maintain your FRS or drop program or whatever it is. I do not want to get into details personally, but there may be some constraints if that past chair is leaving this position and also retiring fully from government at this time.
Why I included that language of "and who's willing and able,"
Yeah,
understanding that it's not a requirement, but if they are willing and able, then we're sort of like saying that that's something that we think would be beneficial as a group.
oh,
But you
definitely.
may or may not.
I mean, we know the past chair would have provided a lot more support, right? If there were, again, not going to go into details, but there were many discussions about what can and cannot be done in that first year.
Understood.
From retiring,
We
so.
are an ad hoc committee, which makes us a little bit different.
And they're not paid positions.
No, it didn't matter.
Yeah.
Pay does not
Not
matter.
about pay, but I think the fact that it's ad hoc would be a different animal as well, but acknowledge your comment.
It gets tricky when somebody starts to, you know, come up against your pension. You don't want to risk that.
So I think we heard some comments about maybe working in sort of an orientation cycle that the ESRI program would be sort of leading.
I put comments in there. Yeah.
Any other comments on succession planning for the co-chairs?
All right.
So
Well,
Do you want to take action on this, or
That was going to be my question.
are you going to wait another meeting cycle to kind of weigh it over?
I have a motion to approve this as written or as,
Let's see, I will make a motion to approve. We had a comment, right?
To include with the additional suggestion about training, a co-chair and training program and an orientation program.
So do we need to include some specific language on that in there now, or?
Aaron from Kinder Morgan said a potential addition would be holding elections and having a transition year in the last year of the term of the co-chair to allow for transition and mentoring. So I think perhaps working that language in some way.
It's a different.
Well, I think that co-chair training and mentoring he's suggesting would happen in the year leading to the nominations, elections of a particular co-chair. So in that 2024 period, 2027 period, it's outlined in the document.
So you're saying change the nominations paragraph?
Add a bunch of detail.
I mean, they do some of that, right? With already updated, but
But it usually gets like.
price tag. Yes.
I mean, 3 years out.
Yeah.
So like that?
See, work its way through the balance, you know.
Yeah.
I think that's-
About the comment in the chat to see if that satisfies Aaron's comment.
Do you like that last sentence under nominations? That works.
Work. Is that agreeable, Dave? Team?
Yeah, did that cover the comments that were in the online?
Yeah, that's in the chat. He hasn't responded yet, but
If the language now covers the comments that were provided, then I would make a motion to accept this as written.
I'll second.
Something like that.
Do we have a motion and a second? Motion from Dave Glicksberg, second from Ashley Painter.
All those in favor? Say aye. Any opposed? Any opposed online?
No.
Motion passes. Thank you, guys. Yeah. All right, next up, Maya's gonna give us an update on 2027 RA.
This will just be really brief. Last time I just tried to present to you sort of where we stand. So to date, we have 17 signed declarations of cooperation. Our contribution numbers are up to $163,750. So we're still shy of our 250,000 goal, but know that you have until October of this year to make your contribution. We think we're well on our way. And those contributions are to support us securing a contractor to serve on your behalf to assemble the information necessary for the 2027 Reasonable Assurance Plan update. That RFP is live, active on the street now. So far, I've received one volunteer to serve on the review committee for that RFP. That committee will meet later this summer after we've received all of the proposals late in May. So if you are interested in serving as a reviewer for the technical support contractor RFP for the 2027 RA, please send me an email and let me know so I can get to scheduling and providing y'all with some background information on that. And then just as a follow-up, at our last meeting earlier this year, we did present to you the draft annual compliance assessment. Usually we would have submitted this to DEP and to EPA by now, but they have requested this additional information that on the remainder Tampa Bay, lower Tampa Bay portion that relies on information not just from EPC, but also from the ambient water quality monitoring from Pinellas County and Manatee County. We are still waiting on Manatee County to finalize their ambient water quality monitoring data. So we have not been able to submit that compliance assessment report yet, but we are confident we'll be able to submit it prior to the June deadline. But since that's changed this year, we do need to make sure that we get the final data from those other partners. So that's where that's at. That's all the updates I had.
Okay, great. Any questions from Maya on that? All right. Marcus is going to give us a discussion about loading estimates. I think we want to try to bring this closer to being in-house, and he's going to
All these
where we might go and how we might be able to participate and help with that.
Yeah, while he's transitioning, please, if your entity is still working through the process of getting a signed declaration back to us, please try to get that to us by the end of October this year.
It is a critical component, what Ed's talking about, and it's the best bang for your buck. You can practically put it on a P card. So I highly recommend getting that payment in.
I heard that as Jeff offered his P card.
I don't have one. I got put in P card jail already, as well as others. I've had multiple people put in P card jail. I struggle with process that doesn't make sense sometimes.
A few things on the agenda related to the loading estimates. Basically, if you're not aware, each year we estimate loads to Tampa Bay for each of the major bay segments. That includes multiple sources ranging from atmospheric deposition, stormwater, domestic point source, industrial point source, groundwater springs, material losses. Is that all of it, right? Yes, atmospheric. A lot of that is estimated from existing data, land use, weather patterns, but the majority of that is of concern to you all is basically the reports that we receive in terms of your the loads from various facilities that you all are responsible for. And that manifests into estimates for the domestic point sources and industrial point sources collectively. So we like to make a call every year to have you all send that information to us, because without that information, we cannot make accurate estimates of loads of Tampa Bay, and therefore cannot ensure that we are meeting our requirements under a reasonable assurance plan. So if you go to our website under the Tampa Bay Nitrogen Management Consortium section, under NMC tools right here, there is the point source reporting template that you can use to fill out that information. I believe Ray in the past has contacted folks individually if it's not supplied to us voluntarily. So kindly request that is voluntarily sent to us first, so you don't have to come to your house and ask you for it. But it's all right there. It should be pretty self-explanatory. I know many of you have gone through this process before, filling out this form. Basically, it's a monthly assessment of flow at the facility, as well as the concentrations for the various nutrients that we can use to calculate the load. So again, we're just making that call to please access this form, download it, fill out the information, and send it to either us or whoever gets the award through the RFP that's out now for the reasonable assurance plan right now.
And even if you're on the stormwater side of the house, if you can make sure that you consult with, your counterpart on the domestic point source side, so you're having a relationship with each other and reminding each other and helping hold each other accountable, we would appreciate that as well.
Yes. Okay. So as added context to that, So if you're not familiar with the SRA program's mission for open science, it's a big part of what we do. We try to be really transparent with a lot of our data products and deliverables that we produce as a program. And historically with the loading estimates, we have basically contracted that work out with Chinook Environmental, now at ESA. We're still going to do that work for this current RA period from 2022 to 2026. But our hope is that for the following RA period, we can sort of internalize that workflow for how we're calculating those loads so that we kind of have more of an ownership over that process. So the methods as well as the products coming out of that workflow will be more accessible to you all, and hopefully a lot of the process will be kind of demystified, because I know there's, even for myself, there's kind of a large learning curve for what goes into those estimates and how they're calculated. So we want to make that information more accessible to you all so you can understand the process and have faith in it, I guess. So as part of that effort, one thing that we have actually started work on is making some of these reports of your loading estimates more accessible to you all.
It's all the way over.
Yeah. So if you basically, at the end of each RA period, we produce this summary report of the plan for the next RA period. And within that report is basically a summary of the estimated loads from all of the point sources, all of the entities you all in the room that cover the previous 5-year period, as well as the allocation that has been assigned. And as far as I know, this is really the only place that is currently available to you all for seeing that information. Otherwise, you'd have to contact us directly, say, what is our load? How does it relate to the allocation? Are we above or below it? But this was the best source of information for the attainment within the RA period. And so what I thought would be helpful to you all, especially as we're kind of having conversations now about Old Tampa Bay in particular, is to make this information more accessible, both as it currently stands, as well as the historical loads that may have been reported at your facility.
So quickly, guys, this table comes from the original final orders where the loads were allocated with the help of Janicki and Associates and DEP based on the 2003 to 2007 loadings at that time. One for each pay segment. And if you have a permit, that's where that number comes from. It comes from, this is an extension of that table because this looks like it's from the RA, right? But this table looks almost identical to this in one of those final orders, which are available on the website that Tino indicated. So if you're ever wondering where your load came from, or do you have a load, it's in those two final orders, one of those two final orders. And within those final orders, they explain how the hydrologic normalization occurs associated with any stormwater loads in here.
Yeah, so there's a lot of good information in this report, but again, this is basically what was determined in the past for how the loads are allocated and how they're reported to DEP. But obviously there's a lot that goes on between RA periods and how you all sort of understand your contribution towards these different loadings. So in an effort to kind of make the information more accessible, I actually created this web page just focusing on basically domestic point sources at this time. I'm hoping to expand it to sort of the other sources, industrial and whatnot, maybe some MS4 permits, but this is sort of a proof of concept where, this is not front facing to the public, but if you have some interest in your organization or others and where you stand with your loading and the allocation, this is more or less your one-stop shop to go to for the domestic point sources. Before I show you an example of these and what they provide, I also want to show you this table. And this is kind of the first thing I put together because this is sort of a reproduction of that table in the RA period, or the RA report. But now it's online in a format that I think is more easily parsable into information you might want to understand. So this is really all it is just a reproduction of those tables in the report. But now that it's online, you can search by your particular organization or the different allocations you might have for the different sources. So let me just, I'm going to pick on Hillsborough County today. So if you just search by Hillsborough County, you can see that they have permits for domestic point source, both reuse and end of pipe, non-point source MS4, and no industrial point sources. And the allocation that applies to each of those bay segments, Hillsborough, Lower Tampa Bay, Middle Tampa Bay, Old Tampa Bay, for the various sources. And the table is also dynamic. So whatever you subset it by, the total load allocation for a particular entity sums up at the bottom. So you can see like, okay, well, that's showing me Hillsborough County, but maybe if I just wanted to see what was Old Tampa Bay in its entirety, what is the total allocation? 308 from all of the point sources. This isn't the total allocation for the entire base segment from all sources, but from point sources, this is what it is. So that's a tool, you know, if you just want to have more access to what your allocation is, how it's parsed up from different sources, it's there. That first tab is basically broken up by entity, so your institution, where you're from. But we also know that each entity has a minimum one facility, but maybe multiple facilities that are reporting for different loads. So I also have this table separated by the major facilities. So I'm going to pick on Hillsborough County again. We see basically the same information, but now broken out by the different wastewater treatment plants that are in Hillsborough County. So you can see there's allocations attributed to those as well at that finer scale. So I think this is cool. I hope you guys think it's cool and useful. Again, this is just an effort to make this information more available to you all. Now, where I think it gets even further interesting is if you pick the report for your individual, where you're from, you can get more information about your loading estimates over time as it relates to your allocation. So I'm going to pick on Hillsborough County again, because I think it's the most interesting example, not that you're doing a bad job.
Unprecedented.
Okay, so these kind of customized reports that are available for each entity, it follows the same template for each entity. But essentially it breaks down your allocation, how you're doing for the current RA period by base segment at the entity level. It doesn't break it down by facility because that's not how we're assessing it. And this is because this is domestic point source, it's also broken down by reuse if you have a reuse allocation, as well as end of pipe if you also have that allocation. And so to start, you see basically there's summaries by base segment because you have allocations for at least one base segment. In Hillsborough County, there's in this case allocations for 3 different base segments. And then a summary of how you're doing for the current RA period. So this is the previous 2017 to 2021, which gives this text summary that says Hillsborough County is under their allocation by X number of tons, and this is based on the 5-year average for the RA period, and then it breaks it down by the different sources. So end of pipe, they're under, and then reuse also under. Good job, Hillsborough County. And then just a numerical summary of that. So the totals for that 5-year average, because again, that's what we report to DEP, what is the running 5-year annual average. That's how we assess the allocation, how it breaks down by the different sources. And then the total, this is your allocation, how much you're above or below. In this case, they're under it, so it's a negative value. And then also how that breaks down by end of pipe reuse. And then because I love interactive graphics, you can see how that plays out by time. So this is basically all the data we have. I think I'd probably cut it to 20 years here, but you can see the total TN load from both reuse and end of pipe for Hillsborough County. And then because this is showing the last RA period, we have the allocation up here and then where that 5-year average lies. So again, the difference between these two lines is whether or not they're above or below their allocation.
And Marcus, this is, so based on the table of contents, this is only for Old Tampa Bay, right?
This is only Old Tampa Bay. Same information if you were to click here.
Yeah.
Say Hillsborough Bay and then no. You can see that same information in the table of their allocation for those different segments. Tabular data, if you want to see the actual numbers. And then this is the same plot, but broken down by whether it's reuse in blue or end of pipe surface water discharges in red. And same thing here, we have the allocation, the 5-year average allocation and the 5-year average. And because we all like interactive plots, you could, add, remove the different lines to see what you want. And that's annual. If you want to go even finer, we have monthly estimates for all of these. This is the same thing, showing the monthly totals for total, as well as DPS or end of pipe and reuse. David, I have no idea what happened in August of 2016.
That's point source, right?
Yeah, that's a point source. That's Adam. Adam, you have any idea what happened, Adam?
I'm gonna go data error.
Right there.
We're not trying to call anybody out. This is a tool for you at your entity.
I don't think you could physically have done that anymore.
We think this is useful. Like Marcus said, it's not going to be a front-facing kind of resource. It's for you as individual participants of the consortium. We're going to continue to report on things at the Bay segment scale, but if you wanted to sort of get more familiar, we're trying to make it easier for you to have access to this information for your specific entity. And if this is something that's useful for you all to, have one-on-one meetings with us to understand something or to see if to catch an error in the data or something like that, we think that we could improve not only the accuracy of the information that we're reporting up to the Bay segment level, but also that, it could help drive some decisions on your part about how to manage your nitrogen loads within your own, your own.
Can you go back to that real quick? I think I know what it was. You know what it was, Adam? I know what it is, I think.
What was it?
It is the diversion of in decommissioning of River Oaks and the transfer to Northwest, and them trying to rebalance the treatment process during about a month or two period. I'm pretty sure that's what that is. Truck trues up date wise almost perfectly. But we were going to look into this.
And that's what this is supposed to do.
We being Adam.
That is the intent.
Mark, awesome. I don't want to geek out too much on this, but are these static? You're like generating them and then putting them up, or do they update based on?
They're static.
Okay.
It kind of goes back to the complications we have with getting that information from everybody. If there was like a standardized data portal that I could ping, like EasyDMR might be one option, but that's still like to a third party that would facilitate this. But my idea is that each year when we recalculate these loads, I can just update it and show sort of interim results if it's in the middle of an RA period or at the end of the RA period, kind of show that overall summary.
Well, I'll talk to you afterward. I was wondering if maybe like Power Suite, you could do like a Power App for people to enter their data, put that in a SharePoint list, and then run a BI front end so that people can play with dates and years and different point sources, but we can talk offline.
Always an option.
But maybe something where it helps you because you don't have to manually generate these year after year, and it would provide a tool for the members of the consortium to just go into that Power App, put their data in, and then it goes into your database.
Yeah, I hear you. Because this follows a template and because we're trying to internalize the process of standardizing the calculation of these loads, a lot of that and work, the manual labor of integrating it should be taken care of. We try to automate as much as possible with these reports. So the burden on me will, in theory, be minimal, other than just sort of QCing the data as it comes in, which we may, once this is fully set up, probably still have to contract out each RA period.
This has been a standing goal of both Consortium and the entry program going all the way back to like the 1990s. And Tony and Ray can correct me if I'm wrong, but we've been asking for this, and we need to work with the department to make sure that we're not being redundant. We want to sort of ease the pain of reporting. So if we could tap into systems that are already in place and just update it on a monthly or annual basis fairly easily with repositories that currently exist, that would be the ideal thing, rather than recreating a different entry point for entities that are already entering this information. But it's stuff we're going to continue to work on and sort of push for more near real-time reporting.
We do, yeah. Everything.
Marcus and Adam together and see if we can.
So the sooner you send me your data, the quicker it'll show up. Sure.
Your summary there, you said it was an average of 5 years.
Yep.
Is it possible to put the years, the range of years somewhere in that summary report there up top?
Sure, yeah. I mean, you
In
can
the
see.
points where you call out Hillsborough County? Yeah, I see it here.
Yeah, it's not front and center. I mean, because this is still just a proof of concept, I haven't quite figured out if, it's got to be referenced to the current RA period, and that should be front and center, but,
Well, I think this is excellent. Yeah, I think it's excellent. It's just helpful to have, what's the time frame that you're talking about? It's 10 and a half
So, yeah,
tons.
and so it's an average of the previous 60 months, each monthly flow.
And ideally, as we move through this next RA cycle, as Marcus and I alluded to, we're going to try to work with the new RA consultant to update the loadings for 2022 and 2023. If we get that information in time and can update this tool, you could see in sort of a 5-year rolling average through this current RA cycle, all the way up to the official reporting period, that would be 2022 to 2026.
see if you're going to meet your allocation. But yeah, if anybody has feedback on this, whether it's just design information or utility of it, I'm all ready to talk.
So your summary is the collective of the MS4 and the sanitary sewer, or is it only applying?
This is just domestic point source.
Okay,
At this
so the MS4 is not part of
Not yet.
this.
I'm gonna try to build that out, hopefully in the not too distant future, but that's the idea. This is just an example of what one of these reports can look like for a particular source.
First tables he showed included both. So.
Yeah.
So if we can get to there, it will help entities understand how they can at least trade within their own entity. So for example, we're running 10 under in the old Tampa sewer shed. I, in theory, could give that to David Glicksberg, Stormwater Group, to address the expansion up in Northwest if he was in arrears on his load in the final order without an agreement, since we're the same entity.
That's the idea.
I just want to add that, Tino, to your point, you may be wondering why we went to make all those phone calls to get the information. Is that the databases that are out there in regulatory agencies are notoriously bad.
Oh, yeah, I know.
And what we have found is that, and we've been working with people, they would say, well, we sent it to DEP, and then we find out that there was an error made on DEP's side so that the actual data were incorrect. And that's why we've always went back to the original data. I think that's, I remember, it was 1994 when we put the first request in the DEP and EPA to do a better job on the, it's a problem throughout. One of the problems is that there are silos, and there's wastewater people up in Tallahassee, and then there's water quality assessment people in a different place. And only if you have a TMDL do you find that they're actually trying to get their acts together. Right. So it's difficult, and it's Marcus. I think this is great what you're doing here. I think that, just for everybody else's understanding is that is the single time-consuming process in this whole thing. So, anything that can be done to make that easier, obviously would be great.
But to your point, Tony, that may be a reason not to go to easy DMR and that data there.
That's exactly why we don't.
Yeah.
We've never done that yet.
Okay. Marcus, a general question, and this isn't on the agenda, but when you look at loads, you mentioned the kind of 6 or 7 categories. On the atmospheric, how are you, or are you making adjustments year over year as vehicle registration changes, the distribution of, IC versus electric? I mean, are we accounting for things like that? There's been so much growth over the last 5 years. I mean, you can just see it driving here in the morning, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we know that the estimates we have for atmospheric deposition could be improved. I don't know all the history that went into how it was calculated, but it's my understanding that the air quality monitoring station we have it's not even in our watershed. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah, it's the one in Verna.
Verna Wellfield and
Yeah.
Thornton,
Yeah.
That has to be a real push for us to get an air monitoring station up here. I don't know whether we can get some support from EPC or from Pinellas County. And I think Hillsborough, we could find some property. I certainly think Brooker Creek would be a terrible place to go, given the predominant windrows in this area. But we really have to get air monitoring up on the north side of Tampa Bay in general.
Yeah, and this is also a priority action in the comprehensive conservation and management plan for the Tampa Bay Estuary Program. I kind of pitched our team internally that I thought was something we should fund at least partially through our work plan. But I think it would be helpful to have some of the team players, sort of like maybe like a little working group to figure out how to actually operationalize this so we can get estimates for what it was going to cost, where it would be sited, those kinds of things. If we could get it a little bit further off the ground, it'd be much easier for us to allocate resources to through our annual work planning process. And I think that's a very appropriate thing to do. Y'all should probably, give us the spurs.
No, I think that if nothing else, we should just increase our fee and contribute to that to make sure that happens, because it's such a huge missing piece in the puzzle here. And really leaves us in a bad place with regard to the problems that Old Tampa Bay are experiencing and scientifically defending potential load allocations. In the absence of that data, we're extrapolating air data from the opposite end of the bay. Really couldn't be farther away, and in the downwind end of the windrow. So it's
Exactly what I was going to say.
Whammy, guys. It's not just, it's over here in the watershed. No, it's over here in the watershed, and the windrow's coming from this direction. So it's not ideal. We don't really know what's coming in. We sort of know what's going out with those predominant windrows. We had one. We actually had one. If you've driven a little past Candy, if you're southbound, you'd have seen it. The trailer's still there. We really need this, even if it becomes a function of us supplementing our dues to get that done. I'm glad to hear it's a comprehensive plan.
Yeah, we've made some investment through the Tampa Bay Environmental Restoration Fund on some ditch research up in Old Tampa Bay through the University of Florida, but to establish a long-term station has been a goal, I think, of the program for quite some time, to bracket the Verna Wellfield is somewhere closer in the watershed.
Jeff, who was running the station that is not defunct? Was that an EPC station or was that?
They were helping with through USF. It was through the BRACE study.
Yeah, but how are we have, EPC does have the air monitoring network, so we need to get together and
Just
discuss
be
this and see what we can do about that. However you want to get it done.
I just want to kind of foot stomp this a little bit because this is something I've been interested in, been talking about for a long time. So a couple of points and maybe a question. This is obviously something that's bigger than the consortium. So this is probably something we can take up at the TAC. And I think we should maybe have this on an agenda item in a future meeting, kind of discuss and even maybe dust off the brace reports. And so that we can kind of get back up to speed. A lot of folks are new. They probably weren't even here when we did that back in the day. But I think it would be good because that might answer some of those procedural questions. Well, who did what, when, who was responsible for what? So I would propose that be maybe an agenda item in a future TAC meeting. And then maybe at that point, call for a subcommittee to maybe look into this a little bit more. Because I agree, I think the time has passed to really act on this. It's the brace was what, 2005?
Yeah.
Something like that. I mean, we've seen
Unbelievable.
crazy changes and they're continuing to happen.
And we left that whole Noreen, there was a whole body of work by Noreen Ford on the table that led us, led me to this really strong concern about we have 3 semi-confined eutrophying basins in Old Tampa Bay that are impacted by traffic patterns on a scale that I don't think you see many other places. Between the Gandy, the Crosstown, between the Gandy, the Howard Franklin, and the Causeway, you can literally, in some of that work, when I was going through that with Charles, you can literally tell what day of week it was based on the deposition.
And then you couple that with the fact that 20 years later, our water temperatures are hitting record highs. We're seeing more and more growth of algae. Yeah, it's a different world now. And I think it's really an important point. To that end, though, my question is, would it be something that this body could maybe have like a support letter or a memo to the TAC to say, as the Nitrogen Management Consortium, we support this effort, and that could eventually lead to, a potential financial support or contribution to this overall effort.
Well, and just as a reminder, your co-chairs do serve on the management board of the estuary program. And so when we are proposing a new work plan each year, that is a suggestion that they can carry forward as a recommendation from this group that we incorporate that into work plan or something else. I also want to just, I already have worked with Mary Lusk, who's done this niche atmospheric research in the Old Tampa Bay segment. She is confirmed to come and present at your August meeting here at the NMC, not at the TAC. But we can sort of talk about how to best couple that with a primer, and maybe what we do, because this, I think it's kind of like a nice bridge into the next agenda items. But because this work for the Old Tampa Bay Assimilative Capacity Assessment is also bigger than the Nitrogen Management Consortium, maybe we could invite the TAC to that NMC meeting and have it as a joint meeting or something to that.
Yeah, I was just going to say before either Jeff or I or somebody else was to put that in front of the TAC, I would want to have a pretty clear understanding of the potential cost, and I would want to have a clear understanding of whether there's broad support for, as Jeff suggested, can you go out, can you stomach another whatever X dollars on your 5-year.
Is there a site? What does it cost? All of those things.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I'm saying. We need like a little working group in it, but I was just reminding folks that you all serve on that board too. So you're a direct line to represent the interests of this group. It'd be great to go through the TAC as well, but we have that.
And the one last thing I'll mention on this, we're thinking of it in terms of a permanent station. There are also options to deploy strategically throughout the year and collect a month of data because maybe the conditions from October to April are similar, something like that. So I do think maybe putting a small TAC together or working group together, that has some background in this area before we took something would be my ask.
So would that be a working group of the consortium or a working group of the TAC?
I don't see why it couldn't be both. It could span both the technical advisory committee and the consortium, folks that have expertise and interest in advancing this issue of air quality monitoring.
I like the idea of a joint TAC / consortium meeting on the 23rd.
Tony,
I just want to add that, so everyone understands, the BRACE program was developed to come up with local estimates of dry deposition rates. It wasn't necessarily to do a long-term process of measuring deposition. One thing I learned, I did a lot of acid rain work back in my old days or younger days, I should say. It's notoriously difficult to measure the chemistry of precipitation. And so that if you're going to be doing it, one of the things you need to be really careful with is the quality control. And that's why we've gone to the NADP, the National Atmospheric Deposition Program. They've been doing in the business of that for 40 years now, Bob. And when you look at the quality assurance that they put into their deposition estimates, it's really clear why more people aren't doing it, because it is difficult. But I just want to make sure that everyone understands that the atmospheric deposition that's reported is based on the same rainfall that we use for the non-point source, et cetera, that rainfall, but we use the chemistry from the NADP site. And in reality, there's not that much difference spatially in terms of atmospheric chemistry necessarily. And that's why you typically look at an air shed. And but I think it's definitely worthwhile to take a look at another opportunity to take a look at the dry deposition rates are just as important as the wet. So understanding what that factor is that we use to calculate total deposition is something that really should be looked at.
Yeah, Tony, I mean, clearly you've got the experience in this area. I find it hard to believe that if you've got, there's got to be something there with thousands of cars sitting in a 5 p.m. traffic jam and not moving for 30 minutes on 3 long bridges sitting on top of the bay.
It's not continuous anymore.
There's got to be something there that we're not seeing.
I think,
By Noreen Ford, Dr. Ford was pretty undeniable. And it couldn't have gotten better. Traffic is
right.
So,
I think Tony hit it on the head. The NADP network is at a national level scale, and if you look at the data, you've seen improvements in air quality throughout the country from that data set and the Verna Wellfield station. It's more of those localized sort of issues that might be affecting a particular bay segment if we have these more refined estimates and localized estimates, and they might not need to be sort of an ongoing monitoring program. We could supplement it again, see how it's changed since the brace days. That might be information enough for this next cycle.
I know this is a really important topic, but I want to make sure we have enough time for the.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, I don't. I hate, when you guys are talking, I hate to stop it.
It's one of those things that I just keep thinking about over and over again.
just one quick thing, not on air, but I do think we need additional stream gauge monitoring. Right now, we're only monitoring a very limited number of tributaries to Old Tampa Bay, and I don't know, are we only doing Lake Tarpon for Old Tampa Bay? I know we're not doing Double Branch. I don't think we're doing Rocky Creek. So I really think we need to consider that. The county was willing to look at those in our area. We would also be recommending the addition of iohexol. There's a paper out there by Joan Oppenheimer and Joe Jackangelo that has made a very strong ratio of iohexol to domestic wastewater influences in your surface water. So be thinking about that, whether your entities could contribute to that. And we don't think we're already going out and doing ambient monitoring most of these tributaries. So for us, it wouldn't be a big additional expense. We'd just be needing to get the data to Marcus and folks to actually incorporate it into any modeling. But I think that's out there as well. The stream gauges were adequate 20 years ago. A lot of these things are a lot more developed now, and we need to start looking at what's actually being contributed from the individual watershed basins.
Yeah, I don't know the cost, Jeff, but we had worked with Tampa Bay Water for the last couple of years. They've been pretty successful working directly with USGS. I know they put some monitors in place on the Alafaya River. It's not cheap.
Well, and Charlotte County's been doing this now for a while. Brandon Moody, if those of you know who he is, the water quality manager for Charlotte County, they've implemented several gauge sites in the tidal portion of the Charlotte Harbor watershed. So he might be a good resource too to talk about, you know, their lessons learned and costs.
Okay. All right, you're up there, go ahead.
Well, we've been presenting to you all about the ongoing Old Tampa Bay Assembly Capacity Assessment Project. So I think Ed's been kind of presenting updates along the way. We've got the contractor team from Stantec and their subs here to present today on some of the task one draft report that they are working on completing right now. So they want to present to you their preliminary thoughts and findings, get feedback from y'all. We did provide a link to the working draft. So we're asking you all to make sure that you read through that working draft and provide comments using suggesting or via email to us by May 5th. They've got two presentations today that they want to run you through where they're at and what they're thinking. So this is Sharon Yu, and she's going to kick it off.
Thank you, Maya. It's a pleasure and privilege to be here today to present to all of you, as well as to those folks virtually. And as Maya said, this is the first task that we'll be sharing our findings with you on in this year-long endeavor. How do I move to the next slide? So as you all well know, there have been many challenges in Tampa Bay over the years, starting with nutrient loading for circulation that have resulted in the non-attainment of chlorophyll A targets, resulting in recent seagrass losses. And also we've had pyridinium blooms that have been persistent in the summertime. And to this end, our team will be presenting to you the work that we're doing as part of the assimilative capacity assessment. And we have 4 tasks that we're working on for the year. And this first task is to evaluate the current management paradigm, methodological framework, and the integrated model, as well as to evaluate the management alternatives that will, in the long term, help make a change in the bay, hopefully, and for the better in the near future. So the nutrient management paradigm for Old Tampa Bay has been on a fairly sort of linear process where we work on reducing nitrogen load that will in turn reduce the chlorophyll, increase water clarity, and increase seagrass cover. So this is sort of the linear pathway. The questions we're asking is, are those current targets, specifically with nitrogen and chlorophyll, consistent with the restoration goals? And in terms of chlorophyll and seagrass, where do the strategies for restoration diverge and overlap? Do we need to look at them concurrently, or do we look at them separately? And do we need perhaps new indicators and targets, given that there have been a better understanding of the bay, and also, like Tina was saying, you know, warming temperatures, we're hitting record highs. Do we need new indicators and targets? And to that end, what are the management options that we can apply to be able to make changes and improve the bay? So in terms of a starting point, what we did was we reviewed the existing paradigm, framework, and integrated model. And I will turn it to our modeling.
Thank you, Sharon. Just by way of, I presume everyone can hear me okay?
Yeah, so this is Steve Bartel. Steve Bartel will be presenting on the efforts that we've been working on and our review. Steve?
Right. Yes, good morning. Just by way of brief introduction, Steve Bartell with Stantec. My background is in aquatic systems ecology. I've been building models of aquatic systems for a good number of years, systems ranging in scale from experimental mesocosms to large impoundments, large river systems, Great Lakes, and coastal marine systems, as well as deep water Gulf of Mexico systems. So just brief introduction. And again, given the time constraints, not going to delve deeply into this, but of course the management paradigm and the ecological framework and the integrated model are concepts and tools that were developed historically to help understand ecosystem dynamics in Old Tampa Bay and support management and regulatory challenges related to, as Sharon pointed out, chlorophyll, seagrass, and other ecological resources of interest. And the key question is going forward, do they accurately characterize the historical and structure and function of Old Tampa Bay? Are they relevant going forward? Dr. Miles Medina will address the nutrient management paradigm. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll just focus primarily on the conceptual ecological framework. And of course, the CEF provides a watershed ecosystem context for the management paradigm. It really fleshes out the linear relationships that Sharon summarized in the earlier slide. The emphasis was on just previously describing the historical system structure and function, particularly in relationship to management goals and objectives. But the key point, and really focusing on the last bullet, is that we recognize that it's an evolving system. Somebody mentioned earlier that the system has changed. So in a sense, we're managing a managed system. We've reduced nitrogen loadings to the system. The system has responded in turn, and now that opens the opportunity for potential other stressors to be unmasked and impose their potential impacts on the system. Some of these things are not represented in the current ecological model. So there's potential for revisions to address some of these, whether it's blue-green algae, epiphytes, disease, sediment quality, changes in temperature related, exacerbated by climate change. So going forward, there appears to be an opportunity to review and revise the conceptual framework to make sure that it is adequate for the future management challenges, and that it adequately captures our current understanding of the system and likely future behavior of the system. So if we go to the next slide, shifting attention to the integrated model, essentially an organized approach for looking at a lot of information there in the form of reports, publications, user manuals, model results. And the couple of months that we've been working on the project, it's obviously been a huge amount of information to look over and attempt to assimilate. And we're looking at it from the context of various evaluation criteria, formulating some opinions about the model performance, and looking at information within the overall context of decision alternatives in terms of accepting or rejecting the model, or looking at possible revisions, or looking at other modeling approaches. And so if we shift to the next slide, again, the integrated model, which I'm sure you're familiar with, essentially operationalizing the conceptual framework in the form of a collection of linked models that feed information to one another and output results relevant to describing system dynamics and looking at potential implications of management actions, initially reductions in nitrogen loading. So it's obviously a representative of the conceptual ecological framework. Some of the initial concerns that we're looking at, there's, as you might imagine, with the complexity of the models, there's a large number of input data requirements, a large number of parameters that have to be derived and evaluated. All the models have been calibrated to various levels of accuracy, but as is a consequence of these complex modeling activities, there are potentials for inaccuracies. For example, looking at preliminary pyridinium simulations, you can see in the lower right-hand corner or slide there that some of the summer peaks are missing and are not accurately modeled, I should say. And this is important because it's the summer peaks in pyridinium production that could be contributing chlorophyll and contributing to the not meeting regulatory standards with regard to chlorophyll. So going on to the next model, just initial takeaways from our initial evaluation of this incredible amount of effort that went into this development of this model. But at this point, we're not arguing for either wholesale acceptance or rejection. It does represent the conceptual framework, and implicit, it's relevant to the management paradigm embedded within the conceptual framework. We think that the model calibration and utility still remains somewhat of an open question. There are opportunities for revision, with seagrass being an important management objective. Seagrass is not explicitly modeled in the integrated model, but the assumption is that it's simply a matter of underwater availability of underwater light. It's known in other systems that consumer populations can have implications on internal nitrogen cycling. That's not considered in the model. And there are other potential stressors, as we mentioned, in our consideration of elaboration or modification of the conceptual model, whether it's epiphytes, disease, sediment quality. There are opportunities to incorporate these into the model. Interestingly, and again, coming back to this concept of managing a managed system, we're interested in potential tipping points. For example, if there are particular scales in space and time where the particular or the principal impacts of nutrients are from internal cycling versus external loading. That's obviously important to know from a management perspective, because the management levers are certainly different. And then finally, we do recognize that there are alternative process models that are available to take a look at, as they might bring to bear either on helping us to understand the system in its current structure and function, how it might function in the future, and contribute to the ability to meet the overall management objectives. So at this point, not necessarily recommending an alternative model, but simply emphasizing the fact that there are other process level models that might be brought to bear to look at to address the overall challenges in understanding this dynamic system, as well as effectively managing it in relationship to regulatory criteria and management goals and objectives. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Medina, who will talk about the evaluation of the management paradigm.
All right, thanks, Steve. So hi, everyone. I'm Miles Medina, and I'm a subcontractor to Stantec on this project. Really appreciate the opportunity to work with you all on improving conditions in Old Tampa Bay. So shifting gears back to the nutrient management paradigm and our evaluation as part of task one. As Sharon indicated, this management paradigm is based on this sort of pathway between, it starts with nitrogen loading as a sort of management lever of control, and its effect on chlorophyll, water clarity, and ultimately on seagrass cover. So this paradigm was originally supported by a series of regression models between each pair of variables in this paradigm. So nitrogen loading, and chlorophyll and water clarity, and so on. And so the first thing we've done to evaluate the paradigm is basically update these regression analyses to understand how they might be changing, how these relationships might be changing in time. Conditions over the past 10 or 20 years might be different than what was observed back in the 1990s. And we're also looking at things on a finer spatial scale. So originally these analyses were done on Old Tampa Bay, the segment as a whole, and we're looking at sub-segments within Old Tampa Bay. And in particular, I'll share some results on the connection between nitrogen and chlorophyll, and then chlorophyll and light attenuation as quantified by the Secchi depth. So the data we use here are, first of all, nitrogen loading data for Old Tampa Bay. These are monthly estimates given by the estuary program. And then we also have monthly averaged water quality data from, first of all, EPC, which are those points, fixed monitoring locations throughout Old Tampa Bay. And we're going to be looking at those monthly averages aggregated to a sub-segment scale as separated by the causeways and the bridges. So we'll talk about 3 different sub-segments, north of Courtney Campbell, and then between Franklin and Courtney Campbell, and then between Gandy and Franklin. And then we also have data from Pinellas County. This is a spatially stratified kind of random sampling design within each of the blue polygons there on the western side of Old Tampa Bay. So the next slide shows some results for nitrogen load and chlorophyll. The picture on the right is corresponds to the subsegment north of Courtney Campbell, and the results are pretty typical. What we generally see is a somewhat weak correlation between nitrogen loading and chlorophyll, so that connection remains for the last 20 years or so. But there is a lot of scatter around the relationship. So the overall, across the board, if you look at nitrogen loading and chlorophyll concentrations within the same month, typically the R-squared value is somewhere around 0.2 or 0.3. We also looked at delays, so nitrogen loading, for example, last month to chlorophyll concentrations this month, or going back 2 months. And in some cases we see correlations with the delays, in some cases we don't. But again, the important thing here is that there's a lot of unexplained variance. There's certainly a relationship between nitrogen loading and chlorophyll, but there are other things going on, as was discussed earlier in the meeting, temperature and other stressors that might influence this relationship between nitrogen loading and chlorophyll. Likewise, on the next slide, when we look at chlorophyll and water clarity, again, we see some correlations, but across the board, but also they're weak with a lot of scatter around the regression line. So, for instance, if we look at any given chlorophyll value in this plot, again, this is north of Courtney Campbell. Chlorophyll concentrations might be associated with a whole range of Secchi depths, and this is on a logarithmic scale, so you have some negative values there. And so, and again, this holds, across different segments that we looked at. There are subsegments that we looked at. So the next thing we did on the next slide was going back to the nitrogen chlorophyll relationship. Was we applied a slightly more sophisticated statistical model that just basically introduces time as a factor. And we can see in some cases in the relationship between nitrogen and chlorophyll, we see in some cases that the magnitude of that relationship definitely changes over time. Here, these results are preliminary. This isn't anything to really draw any meaningful sort of quantitative estimation from. But the point is that we see these changes occurring over time, although it's not necessarily the case in every subsegment. So the picture on the right is showing as we have the TN load on the vertical axis, and the sort of heat map that's visualized there gives an impression of the magnitude of the relationship between nitrogen and chlorophyll. And the yellowish color is the higher magnitude. So we see that that relationship was stronger between around 2010 and 2015, and then during other periods. And as I said, this isn't necessarily the case everywhere. So this particular plot is for Largo Inlet, one of the Pinellas County strata. In other parts of the bay, we see these contour lines are more flat, so the relationship is more steady over time. If we look on the next slide for relationship between chlorophyll and Secchi depth over time, we see something even more complex as you scan from left to right along any given value of chlorophyll. You see the redder areas indicate stronger associations in this case because it's a negative relationship. And so over time, this effect of chlorophyll on water clarity seems to have changed pretty substantially. And again, this kind of varies by subsegment. So the takeaways for this our kind of preliminary evaluation are that the relationships between nitrogen loading, chlorophyll, and water clarity or light attenuation are the correlations are there, but they're pretty weak. And importantly, they differ across subsegments and they vary over time. And so as has been, I think recognized for decades, even going back to the reports in the 90s that were the basis for the current management paradigm, even back then there was a recognition that there are other factors here that influence these relationships. And so for task 2, the conversations we're having are along the lines of understanding these kind of synergistic stressors and how these relationships change, and whether the current management paradigm, accurate as it may be, that nitrogen ultimately affects chlorophyll, water clarity, and seagrass, whether it's sort of incomplete and doesn't reflect the complexity of the relationships, especially considering that things may have changed functionally within the system over the last couple of decades. So in terms of alternatives, recommending alternatives to the management paradigm, again, this is just a repeat of the slide from the earlier part of the presentation from Sharon. But we are, looking at things in terms of whether we need new indicators, whether we need to meet current targets or adjust the targets to meet management goals. And we're framing the alternatives in the report using the picture on the right, where we have sort of management inputs or levers of control along the top. Some of these are levers of control, some of them like temperature, things that we can't really control, but we have to deal with. And then at the bottom, we have management outcomes that we're interested in: chlorophyll, parathenium, seagrass. And in between, there's just sort of a gray box of Old Tampa Bay. There are processes that are not fully understood. And this provides a framing that can help keep us focused on asking the right sort of practical questions that have implications for making management decisions, as opposed to more academic questions that might be interesting, but that might not have much practical consequence. So some of the alternatives that we've been discussing with the estuary program are first revising the nitrogen load normalization. This is a hydrologic normalization of nitrogen loads, and I'll describe that a little bit in a moment. Number 2 is developing adaptive management targets for nitrogen, chlorophyll, and possibly other indicators that our efforts in the coming months might reveal. If we have time for the second presentation today, I'll delve into this a bit more. I'll just say a few things during this presentation about adaptive management. And then a couple of other alternatives are changing the timing and magnitude of freshwater inputs, has effects on salinity and circulation, especially for Lake Tarpon, and then also a focus on circulation and effect improving reducing residence time in some stagnant parts of Old Tampa Bay. So on the topic of load normalization, this is, of course, a sort of discounting of nitrogen loads on the basis of rainfall, right? So more rainfall usually means more runoff, more nutrient loading. And the idea here is that we want to, accommodate that natural variability. And so under the current scheme, the nitrogen load allocation is adjusted, to allow for more load in years that are wetter relative to the 1992 to 94 reference period. On the next slide, we can see that in the picture here that with the current normalization procedure, it's basically a 1-to-1 ratio. So if you have twice as much rainfall this year relative to the reference period, the load normalization factor is doubled. If you have 3 times as much rainfall, the adjustment factor is 3. And so there's sort of no limit to how much the load allocation can be increased on the basis of the normalization. So one idea is, well, let's just get rid of normalization. Let's, after all, the bay is dealing with is likely responding to actual loading and not normalized loads. And so it's important to consider, what is actually going into the bay and not just a discounted load value. Another idea is to sort of update the reference period. The system, the hydrology has changed. The system is kind of consistently getting wetter over time. And so is a reference period from 30 years ago still appropriate? And can we build in some kind of safety factor? There's some amount of natural variability in rainfall, and it might be worth considering how to accommodate some of that variability rather than just adjusting loads in response. And one idea to sort of build in a safety factor is to use a sort of a different normalization procedure. So one example would be in blue on the graph. If we use a sort of logistic function, we can set a cap or a sort of ceiling on the adjustment factor such that in this example, this is just made up, but let's say that we want to cap the adjustment factor at 2. What that means is that no matter how much wetter, this year is relative to the reference period, the load allocation can never be more than doubled, and it approaches that limit sort of smoothly. And when you're near the reference conditions at a value of 1, so this year's rainfall is similar to the rainfall during the reference period, the load allocation is approximately linear as is currently the case. And so this might be, an alternative approach that can kind of provide some wiggle room, but also provide a ceiling on how the normalization is done. Now, moving on to adaptive management targets. Again, the idea here is that, there's certainly a connection between nitrogen and chlorophyll, but as we see in the regressions, these relationships change over time. There can be a lot of scatter in that relationship, and that's due to the fact that there are other sort of mediating factors influencing those relationships. So to develop some adaptive management targets, what we need to do is better understand cause-effect relationships and not just statistical associations, especially aggregated statistical associations like correlations. Understand how cause and effect is playing out over time in the system in the context of several different variables. We'd want to understand how these stressors interact and synergistically affect the outcomes we're interested in chlorophyll and seagrass. Another important topic is hysteresis, which is basically the idea that it's sort of harder to fix something than to break it initially. And so the path to restoration of seagrass, for example, may not just be the reverse of the path toward seagrass loss. There may be additional things that need to be done to restore seagrass beyond just reducing nitrogen loads to some earlier level. And then also we can look at nitrogen loading in terms of different constituents, inorganic nitrogen, for example, rather than just focusing on total nitrogen. Okay, so next steps is we're interested in the sort of confluence of factors that are driving changes across time and space within Old Tampa Bay, and the practical implications that this, our scientific discovery will have for restoration and management goals. And we wanted to open it up to discussion to get thoughts on some of these ideas and see if there are any other alternatives to the paradigm that are of particular interest to the consortium. I know, earlier I was listening to the discussion around atmospheric deposition, which I agree is very important, and additional stream gauge monitoring. I think that's another great idea. But I'll leave it there, and we can have some discussion. Thank you.
Any questions?
Reactions, questions, comments?
I'll start off. I'm good at it. So a couple of quick comments. Actually sort of like the CAP idea on normalization, but that would require the opening of the final orders to implement that change, as would a change in the review period. The review period's based on in lockdown, based on the federally recognized TMDL. Not to say that that couldn't be done. They're not controversial changes in my mind to the final orders. They might be to others.
Permits too, Jeff.
They would then potentially, well, no, I don't know that they would, either one would impact the permit, correct?
A permit language includes all the language around hydrologic adjustment.
Right, okay. Well, and there would be a trickle down effect for some of them. We don't get that benefit, so.
Yeah.
The other comment I was gonna have is maybe your sort of correlation that you were seeing with your TN there could be largely, if those impacts are largely associated with MPDS facilities, that is almost all done. That's almost all organic material coming into this system. So for example, our discharge up into Old Tampa Bay coming down Rocky Creek is 99% organic nitrogen, maybe higher. I mean, we might have a day or two here where we're not basically 100% organic nitrogen. I haven't looked at Clearwater or Largo's numbers. My money is they're exactly like us. We're all hitting 2 parts of TN. You can't get that low and really have anything else left. So that, depending on the fractions of nitrogen that you're looking at coming in here, you could probably at least start by parsing out those MPDS discharges, and just, if you're going to go down that route of trying to speciate at least at that level of organic versus other, that might be a simple line in the sand to use. But your AWT plants are producing organic nitrogen. Almost 100% of their TN comes out as organic. That's really, otherwise, I promise. It's good. It's a great start. Any questions off my question?
All right, I might as well. I was waiting for others to go, but why not? I'll jump in there. Yeah, so no, this is a great start. I agree with Jeff. And I had maybe one question, a couple of thoughts just to take with you. I think nothing that's groundbreaking. You guys probably already know these things, but one quick question I had with respect to your SECI data, how did you guys handle those data points where SECI was greater than bottom?
SECI was greater than what, sorry?
Bottom. So when you can see the disk on the bottom, that's obviously not a valid SECI disk reading because your optical depth is greater than your total depth. How did you handle those data points?
Miles?
Get rid of them.
I'll have to check that. We did some basic QC checks, processing the data before the analysis. But yeah, that's a concern. I'll have to go back and check. I think if some of those observations remain, I mean, it's not surprising that there's a negative relationship between chlorophyll and STECI. So I don't expect it would change the conclusion, but maybe, somewhat change the slope of that line. But the larger point remains that it's the correlations are there, but not too strong. So there's other factors that need to be considered in explaining that relationship.
Yeah, it's a minor point. I was just curious if you saw a large percentage. I'm sure some of those more shallow sites, you tend to see that more than the deeper ones. And that kind of brings me to one of the, just kind of more or less maybe an observation and a cautionary issue, maybe when you're looking ahead to the next phase of the project, which is that, we look at light attenuation as sort of that end member that's the causal factor for where we see seagrass loss. But if you look at this map that's on the screen, a lot of these stations are nowhere near where seagrass grow. And so that's just something to keep in mind when you're doing your data analysis. And the other thing, just as a point of interest, is that when we saw the big loss in grass from 2018 to 2020, there was really no depth pattern to that loss. It was a loss throughout. So we saw seagrass loss in shallow areas and in deep areas. So that would suggest that that loss that we saw, that big 2,000 plus acre loss that we saw between 18 to 20, may not be related to a depth light relationship. Unlike, let's say, for example, and Miles, I know you know this, like along the west wall of Charlotte Harbor, where we saw a retreat of grass along that deep edge. That's a pretty good indication that you're talking about light limitation. In Old Tampa Bay, it was throughout. There was really no depth pattern to that loss. And so that's just something to think about when we're trying to make sense out of, how does chlorophyll affect light attenuation, and ultimately how does light attenuation affect seagrass distribution? I know Kelly Dixon's not here, but if she were, she probably would have also brought up the importance of epiphyte loads on algae. When you go over on the east side of Old Tampa Bay, there's areas where there's heavy epiphyte loads. Well, that's going to completely throw off your optical model, because those grasses may need greater light than those that don't have a heavy epiphyte load. And then the other point I just wanted to bring up from an optical standpoint or a light standpoint is, when we have heavy rainfall, Old Tampa Bay can get pretty colored. You can get relatively high concentrations of dissolved organic matter. And, again, as I'm sure, Miles, the light attenuation of dissolved organic matter behaves differently than that attenuated by chlorophyll. So you may have low chlorophyll, but very low light conditions on those periods of time when you have more dark water. And that, again, is going to attenuate light in those wavelengths that seagrass really need. So anyway, those were kind of my thoughts on the light issue. The other thing I just wanted to point out was that from a macroalgal standpoint, that's something that I think in one of the earlier slides you guys mentioned as one of those, alternate paradigms to look at. But I really think, when you guys start getting into kind of the next phase, macroalgae is, I think, the key to understanding the dynamics of Old Tampa Bay, as well as many other places throughout Southwest Florida. Because again, going back to that 2018 to 2020 shift, not only did we see a huge loss of grass, we saw a huge increase in macroalgae, specifically caulerpa. So attached algae, but also a lot of drift algae. And then over the years since 2020, we've kind of seen a gradual, maybe not so gradual, decline in macroalgae. So now if you go out to a lot of these places in Old Tampa Bay that were just covered with caulerpa in 2020, there's nothing there, it's sand. So there's a dynamic that's happening out there. So I guess my point to that is, while we're really massaging the data and trying to understand and tease out these relationships, let's not lose sight of just looking at what's going on out there. And I think there's a story there that's going to tie in nicely to what you guys are doing. I think that's all. Thank you. I'll shut up now.
Still a lot of Calurba above the
Yeah.
Turkey Campbell, but the hump looks different.
Yeah. I mean, in between 2020 and 22, we lost about 1,500 acres of Calurba based on our maps. And of course, again, I just want to reiterate, when we talk about macroalgae, especially attached algae and our seagrass maps, we're only mapping it in those areas where seagrass we think should be. We know Calurba grows deeper than seagrass, but if it's deeper, and especially if we can't see it from the air, we're not mapping it. So there's probably a lot more Calurba out there than we map because we're not looking at those deeper areas, just a caveat.
I think the challenges for this exercise is where do we have data, sufficient data to begin to articulate relationships that we could then, that could ultimately be incorporated into a change in the final order in a permit. And there are some serious data limitations with respect to drift algae and attached algae that we do need to be aware of. But you're right that we need to, all of these things we need to think about the context of what's actually happening on the ground, but then what are the things that we have sufficient data to make a recommendation that's actionable and in a regulatory atmosphere.
Yeah, I completely agree. But if this is an effort to look at the assimilative capacity without critically looking at macroalgae, you're missing a huge part. And I think what you're going to end up with if you don't do that is you're just going to end up with the same thing we had before, which is weak relationships and kind of, it's going to look kind of the same as what we already know because we're missing that piece. But you're absolutely right. We have to do that in the context of ultimately a regulatory framework and how does that work? That's always the challenge. But I think the start maybe is look at the transect data and maybe even just as a more of an observational function. But I think it would be really neat to look at the transect data and compare that to some of the numbers that
part of the, because we've done some of this, we've started this, is the challenge is there are real differences, and there's a spatial pattern that I think is more likely reflecting who's monitoring which transect rather than what's actually occurring in the water.
Yep, understood.
But you're right that that's a place to look.
Okay, I got one more.
Yeah.
And then we'll cut unless you have something. Okay, and then we have a second presentation.
We do. I was just going to make sure everybody was down to stay for it.
So I'm super excited about looking at changing how water comes in from Lake Tarpon. This has always been a huge concern of mine, potentially restoring that to its original flow. For those of you who don't know, actually went out to Tarpon Spring, believe it or not, through a giant sinkhole on the west side that's been cofferdammed off. Flow really never came in from Lake Tarpon except under ultra extreme high water conditions where that outlet sinkhole couldn't handle the flow. There's certainly an appearance that has created huge muck issues up in that part of the bay. And we'll go a lot farther than that, but it'd be hard to defend that that hasn't been the main contributor to that issue. So I highly encourage that avenue of review as well. So.
Well, and I'll go one step further as to say that a lot of those sediments that you see in Safety Harbor, Mobley Bay, are very muddy or very soft. And I think there was some work that was presented and some work that's been published to suggest that when pyridinium is in its dormant state, it tends to live in those sorts of sediments. So, when we're thinking about pyridinium, I guess this is off topic, so I'll be brief. That's something to think about is where do pyridinium live when they're not blooming? I think that's one area.
So I know we're out of time, but I would love to hear the second presentation. I'm available to stay. I don't know if everybody else is. Not understand.
If you have to leave, we understand, but otherwise I'm going to turn over presenter controls to Miles so he can drive. What we asked Miles to do here is just to give you all a little bit of a teaser of some of the techniques and ways that he's going to be thinking about how we can better understand and query the data that we do have in order to make some of these recommendations. So we just didn't want you to see it all for the very first time once he's presenting results. So this is just kind of to get you familiar and comfortable with the kinds of analyses that he and the team are going to be performing.
Actually, Maya, would you mind or Sharon taking the controls? I think it'll be easier on my end.
Yeah, that's what he's asking for.
I'll just say next slide to advance. Yeah.
Yeah, we got it.
Thanks.
So while that is pulling up the algae, is there a snapshot somewhere from 2018 to 2020?
There's two resources. One is the seagrass transect data that we've given, and that gives you the macroalgae that's collected by those who are doing the transect monitoring, and then the district from their GIS portal. You can see in the seagrass maps, they're actually like comprehensive bottom maps that have the algae information in there along with the seagrass information.
Collected with other stuff at the same time. Nobody's gonna have to do a full effort of just looking at algae. We started with the data rich sources.
Yeah, I can help you with all that. I've got some numbers that are already done that I've presented in the past for looking at specifically attached algae. Yeah.
Okay, Miles, I think we're ready.
All right, cool. All right, so yeah, so we're gonna have, I think, plenty of opportunities, in other presentations to kind of go through some of this. But what I want to do is introduce the group to some, intuition and concepts around some of the approaches that we can use, specifically regarding understanding cause-effect relationships and also hysteresis. So this will, these are concepts and methods that are likely to become relevant in task 2. And so I just want to sort of lay the conceptual groundwork for some of that as we at this point. Let's see, can we go just back to yeah. So where we left off on the last presentation was basically, we have the management paradigm, nitrogen load, chlorophyll, light. These relationships obviously change in space and time, and they're sort of sensitive to other factors. And as you know, Chris and I have collaborated on work in Charlotte Harbor. That's where I've been most of the work I've been doing the past few years has been focused further south on the coast. But we see I think similarities in some sense, and macroalgae and epiphytes is definitely a concern. And then as Maya indicated, there are going to be some sort of data limitations that limit what questions we can ask, and ultimately I think some of the outcomes of this project are going to be recommendations for more or maybe different data collection. But anyway, to guide kind of management decisions toward restoration of Old Tampa Bay, it's really key to understand cause-effect relationships and have some mechanistic understanding of what's going on in the system. Yeah, let's look at the next slide. So what I'll talk about today is just kind of reiterate the point of this kind of management-centric, sort of perspective, focus on management endpoints, levers of control, and outcomes. I want to introduce the causality methodology as something lying somewhere in between empirical work and modeling work. It's not statistics, it's not modeling, it's something a little bit different, but it can give us some deep insights into cause and effect. Then I'll talk just very high level about how we can look at causality in a complex system like this. And then finally, we'll get to hysteresis and development of adaptive management targets. Now, again, so looking at things in terms of management endpoints, what are the things we can control? What are the things that we can't control but have to consider and possibly compensate for? And what are the outcomes we're going for? And then lying in between those two endpoints, there's this sort of gray box of things that we only partially understand within the bay itself. And so, I think this framing is helpful to help guide, what questions are we going to ask? What questions do we need answers to? And of course, which questions can we actually answer? What questions do we have the tools or the data to answer? Okay, next slide. So to frame the causality analysis, I want to kind of draw some distinctions between statistical and modeling approaches. And if you're a statistician or a modeler, you've probably gotten into debates with the sort of the other side. And there's like anything in life, there's sort of pros and cons to any approach here. So with statistical modeling, it's statistical analysis. It's empirical, it's data driven, so it's arguably in some respect closer to the real world. It's based on data, but ultimately we're limited to understanding statistical associations and correlations, not causality. And this is important because to manage an environmental system, I think the questions we really want to answer are about causes and effects. And we sort of settle for answers about correlation. And in a complex system, correlations are really just scratching the surface and often unreliable. So what the picture on the right shows, this is from a seminal paper on this distinction between correlation and causality. This is showing some simulated data from a simple variable of a simple model of two species, X and Y. And depending on when you happen to observe the system, the populations of these two species, you might observe a positive correlation, like in A, things go up and down together very tightly, or a negative correlation in B, where things go in opposite directions, but that's consistent. And or in C, you might see a complete decoherence and a lack of correlation. And so an important point is that, people often say correlation is not causation. Well, it's also true that a lack of correlation isn't necessarily a lack of causality. You can have a causal relationship and yet not observe correlation. And in fact, you might see correlations kind of shift in magnitude and even in direction, sometimes being negative, sometimes being positive, if that relationship is more complex. Correlation is about a very specific type of relationship. And if we're talking about linear correlation, we're talking about things that just change in proportion to each other in a very simple way. And then the final point on statistical modeling is that it is modeling in a sense. I mean, when you do a regression, you're specifying a model. You're saying, we're making assumptions about, to some extent, how things work in the system, and then we're trying to quantify and assess like what is significant in there. The assumption of the model that the results are dependent on. And so if we're dealing with a system where there's so many unknowns, what I'm ultimately going to suggest here is that we can do a sort of pre-modeling step, working with the data more directly, that can help us understand what's going on in the system, and then that can inform modeling for statistical tests and mechanistic modeling. But even statistics involves modeling. Okay, next slide. So on the other side, we have mechanistic modeling, which of course is fundamentally concerned with causes and effects, a mechanistic process. And this is a criticism that modelers often make of folks that focus on empirical work and empirical relationships, is that, well, you guys are just dealing with correlations. We're actually stepping through what's going on in the system. We're simulating the actual system. And of course, modeling is a very powerful tool, particularly for looking at counterfactual analysis, which is basically like, if we're dealing with, what if scenarios, what if management does this or that, how would that play out? But again, here we have to assume a model, and we have to calibrate that model. And there's uncertainty associated with each of those things. So on the next slide, this kind of frames, how we lose information each time we step away from the real world. So if the real world contains 100% of the information, even by the process of collecting data, we can only collect data on so many things in so many places, finite timescales, we're losing information. And yet the data are like our best window to the world. And then whether we're talking about statistical modeling or mechanistic modeling, we have to specify a model that's sort of abstraction of the system. And so there's some additional loss of information there. And then finally, we have to calibrate the model. And there's an additional loss of information. And so by the time we're interpreting results of modeling, we're taking more and more steps away from the real world, and we're talking about what the model is like, and that's only relevant to the real world if we believe that there's a correspondence, a meaningful correspondence, and in whatever context we're focused on between the model and the real world. And so this third way that I'm putting forward here, and that I have expertise in, lives somewhere in between the data and the modeling in this picture. So on the next slide, this kind of approach has been called, I usually call it causality analysis. It's been called empirical dynamic modeling or equation-free modeling. It's not really modeling because there's no underlying model. And so it's empirical, it's data-driven, but it's not statistical. It's not based on probability theory or any kind of statistical model. But like mechanistic modeling, there's an emphasis on process and mechanisms, understanding cause and effect, but without the assumptions and the sort of lead time of developing a mechanistic model. So we can start to understand things in terms of cause and effect and not just statistical association or correlation. All right, so let's go to the next slide. So with causality analysis, the goal is to discover management relevant causal interactions, quantify the strength of these interactions over time. As we saw in the previous presentation, even interaction between something like nitrogen and chlorophyll, which in some cases might be straightforward. What we see in Old Tampa Bay, and is actually, turns out to be pretty typical, is that a relationship like that can be quite dynamic and variable over time, depending on other things going on in the system. And I want to be clear in this context of sort of equation-free modeling and approach to causality. Causality is a big word, and what it means here is a consistent pattern of interaction over time. So the distinction is that you might ask questions that are causal questions that are have to do with a pulse disturbance, like did Piney Point cause an algae bloom? This isn't a consistent pattern of interaction. We're talking, in this case of Piney Point, we're talking about a sort of discrete event and what followed. For this kind of analysis that I'm emphasizing today, we're talking about consistent patterns over, a decade or more. So there's often a seasonal component to that. There might be other cycles that lend themselves to this kind of analysis. And an important thing is that we're implicitly going to be able to account for the state of the broader system, other variables in the system, even if we're asking questions about a particular pair of variables like nitrogen and chlorophyll. And then finally, I just want to draw a distinction between sort of root causes or ultimate causes and proximate causes. So, the point is that even if we don't know every step along the process, as we may, want to articulate in a mechanistic model, we can still answer questions about causality between things that, that have some distance between them. So, for example, nitrogen loading, itself doesn't directly cause chlorophyll. There's all kinds of steps along that path. But we can ask questions about that relationship, just like we can with statistics and so on. And so we can frame our management questions in relation to these kind of endpoints, whatever is appropriate for the objective, without necessarily accounting for every mechanistic step along the way. So hopefully, with all this, you can see that statistics has its place, modeling has its place, and this third way can help us answer some questions. I think it has some of the benefits from each of those two sort of traditional approaches. It's empirical but not statistical. It's concerned with causality and mechanism without having to assume a mechanistic model. All right, let's look at the next slide. So how does the analysis work? So, I've taught this in graduate courses, and you can spend a couple semesters just, introducing people to it. So, and this is one slide, so this is very, very high level. There's a lot of math and so on behind each step here, a lot of diagnostics to go into checking assumptions and so on. But it can kind of break out into 3 steps. So if we've got data on a particular variable like chlorophyll, we can isolate signals in those data that represent a systematic pattern of behavior. Like I said before, there's typically going to be a strong seasonal component there. There might be other cycles. There might be kind of long-term trends. And that's going to give us a sort of view of the deterministic behavior, the systematic behavior of that variable. If we have multiple variables, we have nitrogen, chlorophyll, and so on. We can do that for each one and get a signal on each of those. And then based on each of those signals, we can reconstruct what's called phase space. And this gets kind of abstract, but this is what I have pictured on the right here. Phase space is sort of an abstract way of visualizing the dynamics of a system. A system just means, a set of variables. And as it turns out, of course, in the real world, systems are, there's way more variables than we could ever hope to keep track of. But an interesting property of a lot of complex systems is that they are effectively reducible to a low dimension, which means you can understand them with respect to a small number of variables. And we do a lot of diagnostics to make sure that that's the case in any given system. And so we can take a signal on a single variable like chlorophyll and reconstruct so that signal tells us about the dynamics of chlorophyll, the behavior of chlorophyll. We can use that signal to reconstruct the behavior of the system that chlorophyll is part of, which is really quite, a bit of magic that underlies this. It's kind of surprising at first that you can learn something about an entire system just by observing a single variable within that system. But once you get into it, it really makes sense because any particular variable, any single variable in a system is going to have information about everything that influenced it. That variable is doing sort of a dance with everybody else in the system. And so it's going to contain some information about those other variables that influenced it. And when you have a complex system where there's a lot of feedback and nonlinear pathways, each variable potentially contains information that can allow this kind of reconstruction of system dynamics from the dynamics of a single variable. So what these pictures represent is at the top there you have this guy called M. This is a manifold for it's a picture of the system dynamics. And that's something we don't, in practice, really have access to. That would require data on every variable in the system, and we often don't even know what all the variables are. But using this reconstruction procedure, we can take the X signal or the Y signal and do a reconstruction. Those are what's shown on the bottom. And these reconstructions are going to share essential properties with the original unobserved manifold M at the top there. And so using these reconstructions, we can look for a very particular kind of correspondence between them that is going to allow us to draw inferences about cause and effect between the variables that the reconstructions are based on. So again, we're talking about causality in terms of systematic patterns of interaction based on signals that represent systematic patterns of behavior. So the next slide shows just some of the results from a red tide, a study on red tide that I published a couple of years ago. This provided empirical evidence linking red tide blooms on the coast near Charlotte Harbor to nitrogen loading, first from the Caloosahatchee River at the S79 flow control structure. Then upstream, we traced that nitrogen signal to Lake Okeechobee at S77, and even further upstream to the Kissimmee River at S65E. And so we were basically able to trace this kind of causal signal upstream from the coast in terms of red tide dynamics up through this engineered flow path all the way inland to the Kissimmee River. And so this can help us understand, where sort of eutrophication or pollution signals are coming from, but also within Old Tampa Bay, we can try to understand interactions among variables that are driving chlorophyll. Yeah, next slide is fine. Thanks. So we want to understand interactive sort of synergistic effects of nitrogen loading, freshwater inputs, temperature, salinity, other things on algae and chlorophyll over time. This kind of analysis can help us understand how those interactions are occurring and how they're changing over time. And then, as I just showed with the red tide study, we can trace signals from the bay upstream into the watershed if we need to, talk about targeting, certain parts of the watershed that are strong drivers of what's going on in the bay. Okay, and then moving on to the other topic, hysteresis and adaptive management. So again, if you're not familiar with the term hysteresis, it's just a fancy word for saying it's harder. It's often harder to fix something than it was to break it. The picture on the right is a sort of idealized kind of cartoon version of hysteresis, where if you start at the red point and you increase nutrient inputs, and that increases chlorophyll, there's this sort of degradation pathway or trajectory. The system has become degraded. And now, as environmental managers, we want to restore that system. And hysteresis means that the path to restoration in green is different than the path to degradation. It's not just walking backwards along the same path. In this example, the way that these lines are set up, the ultimate restoration endpoint isn't exactly where you started. And sometimes that's the case. Restoration to like some kind of pristine condition is sometimes not feasible. And so understanding what a reasonable, feasible goal is important. And then also understanding the path to get there. So, it may take, for example, in this cartoon version, decreasing nutrient inputs to some threshold before you start to see a response. And so you see that green curve is sort of flat until you get to some threshold, and then it starts to dip down in terms of chlorophyll concentration. And that threshold might be well beyond, less than the threshold that we found, on the degradation pathway. So it might be that the tipping point for degradation was one level of nutrient input, but the threshold we have to reach is perhaps something more aggressive, an even lower nutrient input. So this is the idealized version. On the next slide, we have, some just initial look at what this might look like in Old Tampa Bay. We don't know yet if there's, hysteresis and to what extent in Old Tampa Bay, but if you plot Haladuli seagrass abundance against nitrogen load, we can look at these trajectories in this two-dimensional space. So highlighted in green is a sort of restoration trajectory where seagrass, really went up as we got into 2009, 2010. So it went from a degraded state to a more restored state. And then more recently, we have the period highlighted in red where we've seen degradation and seagrass loss. And so what's important here, and we're putting this in the report, is that this kind of hysteresis analysis typically is done in a sort of qualitative way, and I've never seen it applied with any more than two dimensions like we have here, nitrogen load and seagrass. In reality, though, you might need more variables to explain what's going on here and to really understand these trajectories. And so we might need to add temperature or salinity or some other things. A third dimension, maybe even a fourth dimension, to really understand these trajectories and be able to draw some inferences about what we can expect the system to do based on, in response to some intervention based on how it's responded to something similar in the past. It's almost certain that two dimensions as shown here are going to be inadequate. So this is really just a proof of concept to illustrate the idea, not, a very meaningful result. All right, let's look at the next slide. So given what we can learn from causality analysis that I described, hysteresis, we can start to talk about adaptive management targets. And this is the idea that there are certain things we might be able to control, like nitrogen loading to some extent, other things that we can't really control, like temperature. And having an adaptive management target means, to some extent, trying to compensate for the things we can't control, in terms of the things that we can, and sort of monitoring, how things are going and seeing, do we need to adjust our targets as temperatures warm? Are we going to need to compensate in terms of other things to sort of make up for that? And at what point, can you not compensate anymore? And so this paper published last year by Dunick and Coate gives a nice example where we've got light availability on the horizontal axis and temperature on the vertical. And light is something that we can control through loading and whatever. What the black curve represents is the let's say seagrass growth rate, a growth rate equal to 0. And so that's just a condition where we want to maintain seagrass. We're not trying to add more seagrass. We definitely don't want to lose seagrass. So just in terms of maintenance, we follow this contour line, which gives us this kind of combination of, in this example, light and temperature conditions that are conducive to maintaining seagrass. And if you look at the first point with the blue lines pointing to it, that's the sort of current condition. This is how much light things are getting. This is the temperature. And if we increase the temperature, that means we're moving up along that black curve. There's a corresponding increase in the light that's required to kind of compensate for that temperature stress. And so this can give us, and again, this is just 2 dimensions. We can do this in multiple dimensions as well. We can look at different combinations of stressors and synergistic stressors to set targets for, for example, nitrogen or perhaps something else that are conducive to goals for chlorophyll, for seagrass, and that account for these things simultaneously. So one final comment here, the other contour lines, that are in gray that are highlighted, like the black one, these just correspond to different values of the growth rate. So if you wanted to increase the growth rate, you might use one of the, follow the path along one of these contour lines toward the right in the bluish section. All right, let's look at the next slide. So the takeaways are that reducing chlorophyll and recovering seagrass is going to require a deeper understanding of causal mechanisms, cause and effect, not just statistical associations. We can approach causal questions empirically while avoiding statistical and modeling assumptions. And so, this is sort of a pre-modeling kind of scientific discovery thing. It's not to replace statistics necessarily. It's certainly not to replace modeling. There's certain things you can only do with modeling, but it can definitely inform how we do that modeling. So as Steve talked about in the previous presentation, there may be some things that are missing from the integrated model, components of the system that we might discover through this causal analysis that tell us, oh wait, these are mechanisms and components of the system that aren't represented or aren't represented adequately in the integrated model. Or maybe the integrated model is doing things that don't really correspond. There's causal structures in the integrated model that don't really correspond to what we see in the real system. And of course, the causal analysis can also, more directly inform management as well. There's some directly relevant results that can come out of that. So I can kind of do double duty, informing management and modeling. So I'll leave it there. Thanks for sticking around longer, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Questions, anyone?
Any thoughts?
Folks getting sort of the gist of the directions we're headed. We talked about this in the in terms of the actual Tampa Bay. I think what we're trying to do new for the alternative management interventions that might also have a direct impact on the endpoint. So it might be the nutrient diet plus exercise and sleep. And those exercise and sleep relate to maybe hydrologic or other sort of stressors that the system is now experiencing. So we're hoping that this sort of pathway of stepwise analytical approaches will sort of illuminate where the greatest influence is towards the endpoints of interest, lower chlorophyll levels, more seagrass, ultimately have an effect in the future. And those are the levers that we're kind of talking about throughout this whole process. And I think these analyses are framing sort of those levers and endpoints throughout the approach. And that's what we're trying to drive with this new work and this system of capacity assessment, not just talking about the diet, but the diet and other potential things that could help us meet the ultimate endpoint goals of the system response that we're trying to achieve in Old Tampa Bay.
So to confirm, we're going to take a look at all three approaches, or we're going to pick one?
So they proposed several alternatives using these sort of assessments, and they're already on a path to working towards using all these approaches. I think the task 2 report will hopefully identify, what might prove fruitful to move forward on the project to ultimately inform our adaptive management, what actually needs to go into the reasonable assurance addendum that will deliver to DEP, whether that's a new target or a new loading sort of benchmark for the system, or looking at things from a smaller scale. I think these analysis will drive sort of what that new potential endpoint needs to be for the system to get it back on track. From there, what are the levers that we could pull to get it to that endpoint?
And if you have strong feelings about any of those alternatives, when you review that task 1 draft report, please provide that feedback in that direction there, because like I said, we're going to be going down a path. So the extent to which you help us choose that path, you'll be happier with the outcome, hopefully.
And ultimately, we need greater and greater discretization as this gets tighter and tighter. I'm not sure this is the step for that to occur, but it ultimately does need to occur. Within 7 years, the 4 MPDS outfalls up here will probably be virtually discharging nothing. If they are discharging anything, they'll be going to 0. We expect to be at 0. We'll still be maintaining our outfall, but for a high flow day in August here or there. So those guys sort of almost start to get taken off the table in this evaluation, and that sort of leaves stormwater.
And
At least in this base segment.
I think the team is proposing, some of taking a look at some of those kinds of approaches. And, if that's where we end up, then I think that just lends support for the need for these modeling tools to help take us down that, finer look at the non-point source loads.
So I certainly think that's what we would hope would come out of this. I don't have any expectation that you're going to come back and tell us that the load's okay. I've felt that way since I got involved 24 years ago, that this was the one base segment that wasn't quite like the others, because it's got 3 land bridges. It takes half a year to flush, depending on whose model you look at. But
I think that's a question, though, if others, we'll be doing analyses to look at this, but the hydrologic normalization, I think, is showing us that, well, if we don't hydrologically normalize and we just try and get the actual loads to the adopted TMDL level now, what would we see? What would the outcome be? I think that's a question.
I think that's a valid question. Even the capping hydrologic normalization, who all's out of compliance if we do that? But I would also say I think it would be hard to not remove the normalization, I believe, and Jeff, check me on this, is in the final order that addresses all 4 of the individual base segment orders. Therefore, if you change it there, you're going to change it in all 4. It may be a more applicable paradigm in those other 3 base segments, because I don't think there's a one of them that flushes in more than about 72 hours as a general rule, depending on what's going on, tidal.
Yeah, the actual, it's again, like what's the Sesame Street factor there? If the actual loads are already all the way well under the allocated limit, then.
Yeah, well, and when I looked at it, and I mean, I had a different perspective of it, but truthfully, there were still facilities up in Old Tampa Bay that had not gotten to be Grizzle Fig by the time the baseline evaluations were being done. They were on a path to get to Grizzle Fig, but were operating under administrative orders to finish that construction. So basically, they probably were still pumping out some pretty high numbers there, TN wise, with ammonia, with some other constituents other than just organic, or speciation other than just organic nitrogen. So unlike the other bay segments where Tampa had already gone AWT because they had gone under Grizzle Wilson, not for high level disinfection, but for nutrient removal. And actually the other Hillsborough facilities in those bay segments were pretty small in size at that point. There wasn't a lot of development in South Central, contrary to our existing problem. It probably didn't manifest itself in such a strong way, combined with the three combined basins that we have in Old Tampa. So I just want this to make sure this is a step that, and it sounds like it is, that possibly gets us to the next step where we're actually able to see, is it Lake Tarpon? We might be able to see that now. We might be able to see that under this approach. Is it Double Branch? Is it Rocky Creek? Is it, is it Feather Sound? Where is it? Oh, it's all of them. How do we deal with that? So, but I like their approach. I mean,
Well, mull it over. We're asking for comments by May 5th. If you have your organization blocks your access to Google Docs, please send me an email. I'm happy to send you a document that you can comment on directly. I think the contractor team might be uploading some additional revisions early next week. So if you don't have time this week, that's okay. Starting say, early in the early part of next week, take a look at that document and again, provide us your thoughts so that we can incorporate it for the next steps.
Yeah, we have a new version to you guys scheduled for the 29th. So pick it up after then and it'll be much cleaner. Had a first round of comments already.
You can send a follow-up reminder when it's available.
I just have maybe a quick plug for if you're interested. So a lot of what Miles has talked about is, I think, pretty groundbreaking, but it's also really complicated. If you haven't already done so, he published a paper in 2022, it's Medina et al. In Science of the Total Environment that goes into a lot more detail on how this was applied in the linkage between Lake Okeechobee, Caloosahatchee, and the occurrence of red tide in Southwest Florida. I think that was one of the most significant papers that has come out in many years. So I encourage everybody to read that if they haven't already.
We can share that with the group as well.
do we have any other questions or any other open discussion items? I know we're running quite late, but we can entertain a couple if anybody had any.
I just have a very brief update. So with respect to our 24 seagrass maps, we have finally completed all the image acquisition for the entire district coast from Cedar Key south to Charlotte Harbor. For Tampa Bay, we've started doing the final post-processing and mosaic of that imagery. So we should be starting the photo interpretation within the next 4 weeks or so. And our field work is well underway. We've completed most of the accuracy assessment data collection. We're continuously doing the field verification work. So hopefully we're looking at a public release of the numbers sometime in early 25 with some of the draft numbers coming out before that. So I know, Ed Shop will be talking to you guys long before that point when we start developing the maps. But
It's well underway, and despite the El Nino winter, which was a real pain in our rear end, we did get all the acquisition done.
If there- Tony?
I just want to add that, I don't know if many of you know Daryl Joyner, but Daryl has come on to work with me at ESA.
Okay, well, if there's no other questions, we'll adjourn the meeting and we'll see you in August and try to get your comments in. Think about the nominations, whether you might want to nominate, who you might, whether you might want to do this work and be prepared for August. Thanks, everybody.